great event today. Again, I'm Mary Beth Sewald, President and CEO of the Vegas Chamber, and I'll be your host for today's virtual event. Today, we're very excited because we're going to get an inside look from industry leaders in the financial markets, real estate, technology, and healthcare. And these are truly the four key areas that have been affecting our economy through the pandemic. And we're going to get a look at what these industries have been facing, but also the things that they are looking at for the future. So I think these are questions that have been on our minds, and it's kind of the, like I said, the $1,000,000 question. So we're really eager to get started today. The Vegas Chamber and City National Bank are truly excited to host today's event. It's part of a series of conversations created by City National Bank to discuss these challenging and difficult times. I also want to thank City National. They're one of our Vegas Chamber Presidents Club members. They've created this opportunity. They're celebrating their 67th year of business, and they're just a great supporter of the Vegas Chamber and our entire community. So now it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our special guest for today's conversations. These thought leaders are really going to share their insights and observations about their industries with takeaways that we think are going to be beneficial to all of us. Today, our panelists are Paul Single. He's the Senior Vice President and Director of Fixed Income Investments for City National Asset Management. Thank you so much, Paul, for being with us today. We also have Michael, Kazemzada. I got it. Michael Kazemzada. Okay. Senior Vice President of City National Bank's Real Estate Division in Orange County. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. Carla Perez, who has a much easier name to pronounce. She's the Regional Vice President of Universal Health Services. And then we have Betsy Fretwell. She's the Senior Vice President of Switch Cities. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today for what I know is going to be a really thought-provoking and insightful conversation, and looking at your industries and what's ahead for everybody. So let's get started with Mr. Paul Single. I know that City National Bank serves a wide variety of industries, Paul: food and beverage, franchise, finance, tech, and entertainment. You have about almost 40 years of experience in the banking industry, managing investment portfolios and so forth. Can you give us sort of an overarching viewpoint of the economy, sort of COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID, and what you think we're going to be seeing moving forward?
Yes, Mary Beth, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. It's a real treat for me to be here. It's quite an esteemed crowd. In terms of the economy, we see it being blockbuster this year. The Federal Reserve Bank is expecting growth to be 6.5%. This will be the fastest pace of growth since the early 1980s, when Reagan had his big spending programs going on. And this should really help drive down the unemployment rate, which is still at a relatively high level. I mean, the severity of the recession was very extreme. GDP fell more than 10% last year. That's about 5 times the size of a decline of the average recession in the United States. So you can see how severe it is. It is starting to move back. And the news that we're seeing on the vaccine and the reduced amount of cases and hospitalizations is really important in terms of changing people's attitudes to go out and spend quite a bit. Those that have not gotten vaccines, they've always gone out and spent. That's not a problem, but it's the crowd that has been getting the vaccine. They're a little bit more cautious, and they're a little bit slower moving at that. But I think by the time we get into the third quarter, the summertime, when families can go out and travel once again, we'll see some really, really strong consumer spending going on, and that will really propel economic growth. And that's the first stage of what we're looking for, the consumption. We need a feedback loop that needs to go on with the economy. The consumption will lead to more business spending, more business hiring, which then leads to more income into houses, which leads to more spending. So this looks like it will be a long and productive economy that we should see strong growth well above trend for the next few years.
Well, excellent, Paul. That's fascinating. I love how you describe the loop and the feedback loop. And speaking of fast growth, like you mentioned, Betsy Fretwell, Senior VP of Switch Cities, how was the tech industry impacted by COVID? And it seems like we've become even more reliant on technology. So what's happening in your world?
That's interesting because Michael Dell was quoted as saying technology really prevented a complete societal economic meltdown. And I believe he's right. Over the last 15, 16 months, the tech industry really had to step up to address a whole host of issues associated with remote working, work from home, retailing at home, and everything else from home, right? So all of our industry really had to adapt quickly, but also had to build on some key things that were essential for us to keep this vital infrastructure working. So, we could only send about 30% of our people home during COVID. The rest of them needed to be on site and healthy and safe. So that took quite a bit of effort, actually. I mean, many of you know about Switch. Switch is kind of Armageddon ready. So all we had to do is adapt those plans to be ready for once in a century pandemic, hopefully, maybe longer going forward. But we have an incredible chief medical officer, which is probably fairly unique in the data center industry, which helped us prepare our employees and our facilities for robust production during this period of time. But this was not a time where this part of infrastructure could go down. And in fact, we're seeing significant growth trends going forward throughout the data center industry, as well as the public cloud computing activities. As people have kind of modified their lives, their lifestyle, and their working relationships so that they are using technology much more frequently.
Well, and speaking of just growth that has been unprecedented, Michael Cousins-Zada, I got it right that time, Senior Vice President, City National Bank Real Estate Division. Talk to us for a second about the current update in the world of real estate as it relates to those sectors that were impacted the most, like office and retail.
Thanks, Mary Beth. To start with office, companies, employees like us, we had to immediately become mobile. The sector did well in responding to that and getting most of us into a work from home environment. But clearly it had an impact on rents and vacancies. First quarter, year over year rents were down double digits by percentage in many metros. Some smaller losses and drops in smaller markets. And then on vacancy, if you just look at a single data point, probably 300 basis point increase in overall vacancy, and that's across the board. Vacancies have grown into the middle teens by percentage. And, as we kind of look forward and how this will play out, rents and vacancy will remain under pressure, but at a diminished level. I think the peak of the pressure is coming next year. And then what happens from now until then is kind of speaks to one of the unknowns. We've gotten through a lot of the unknown, but how these companies, whether it's in tech or healthcare or a variety of areas, how they're going to handle their space needs as they look to re-up their leases, as they look to expand. A lot of companies right now are in pause, and as they're trying to make decisions, take a look at how flexible work scheduling and work from home might come into play. But the ending comment, I think, back to us for office is, we're all returning to the office as of right now, if we haven't already done so. Switching over to retail, it's been interesting because the impact was fragmented. Personally, we've all experienced the reality of the shutdown of those businesses. The hardest hit were our regional malls, and more specifically, restaurants and entertainment-focused businesses. And in general, there were destination venues as opposed to grocery and drugstore properties that fared well. But again, national level vacancies are up in the double digits in the impacted areas. Rents are under pressure. And, you know, while we're seeing the ongoing reopening of businesses, which is clearly a good thing and an important thing, you know, the damage is clear. You know, you look at the restaurants specifically, and the estimates on how many of those have closed permanently. And then as we get back to technology, which was touched on just briefly, you know, think about retail as it relates to those businesses that were impacted previously by e-commerce and Amazon prior to COVID. And so I think the future for those businesses is going to prove to be even more challenging in dealing with that form of competition.
Yeah, you know, Michael, you hit the nail on the head. We hear all of those points a lot from our members at the Vegas Chamber in the retail space. And so it's great to get your perspective on that. Carla Perez is the Regional Vice President of Universal Health Services. And Carla, you know, hospitals, I don't know if any industry that maybe was impacted any more than your industry was by the pandemic. Obviously, you know, taking care of your patients and also protecting your own workforce at the same time. There's also a lot of revenue losses on your side. Where is the medical industry, the hospital industry now? Are things sort of at all back to normal, or what's happening in the health sector?
Thanks, Mary Beth. You know, your question is related to the tremendous loss of revenues, but, you know, frankly, I would be remiss if I didn't comment, first of all, on just the fact that there was truly no greater toll than the tremendous loss of life and the emotional toll caring for those patients that took on our healthcare system. Throughout my 8 hospitals, we took care of over 18,000 COVID positive patients since the inception. And Frank, I couldn't be more proud of their diligence and frankly, their resilience to care for our community and continue to care for our community. You know, others talked about working from home. I had 10,000 employees who couldn't work from home. They all had to come to work every day and did, and frankly, ran into the fire. So very proud of all the work that all of the healthcare industry did. Specific though to the loss of revenues, I would say that the cancellation of elective procedures, you know, frankly, did have an impact, but most of those procedures were ultimately rescheduled for those that frankly needed to have them. The greater impact, though, did come from the loss of the emergency department volume, you know, where frankly, patients were just afraid to seek care for fear of contracting COVID. And unfortunately, many patients either didn't seek care or sought care too late. And there are counties across the country that reported up to a 50% increase in deaths at home. Kind of gives a whole new meaning to scared to death when frankly, you're so scared to contract a disease that you end up dying from another disease because you didn't seek the care that you needed. And we frankly saw a lot of that, particularly delayed care where patients waited a very long time to come in. And so from a loss of revenue perspective, again, that was probably the greater impact. Where we are now is that hospitals are recovering. Procedural volume is returning, and I think patients are feeling more comfortable. We ran a campaign that was called Safe, Trusted, Ready, and frankly, those were just not words. We truly were, as a healthcare industry, very, very safe places to be. We always had adequate PPE for our employees, for our patients. We have always been safe, trusted, and ready. From a financial perspective, I think hospitals are also recovering. It was an extremely difficult year for the healthcare industry. The loss of volume and then frankly, the expense incurred caring for the COVID patient was extremely expensive. COVID positive patients stayed in the hospitals for a very long time. Many of them were very acutely ill, many in the ICU for a very long period of time. And the pharmaceuticals were extremely expensive. We did receive, as an industry, CARES funding, but most hospitals reported that they only covered about 40% of their cost with CARES funding. But I think it also changed the industry and how we look at care in the future. And hopefully we'll get a little bit more time in the call today to talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, on that note, since you brought it up, that was one of my questions, Carla, is, how has the pandemic changed the healthcare industry moving forward? I think that's also a question that's top of mind for all of us.
Sure. I think that um, patients have gotten used to seeking alternative ways to get their care. And I think when we talk about technology, I think telemedicine was lifted fairly very, very quickly throughout the pandemic, and a lot of physicians' offices were able to transition to telemedicine platforms. We did in the hospitals as well. I think patients, frankly, really liked that method of getting care where they didn't have to leave their home. And I think telemedicine is here to stay, and I think you're going to see even more advances in telemedicine. Certainly doesn't replace, placing hands on a patient and doing a full examination. And so we'll always have that level of care, but certainly telemedicine. I think patients have also sought alternatives. For example, we have freestanding emergency departments, which are just smaller versions of the emergency room in the hospital. And during the pandemic, those facilities didn't report any loss of volume. So I think patients felt more comfortable going to a smaller environment than they did going to the much larger hospital itself. And so I think you're going to continue to see that. And I think just in general, you're going to continue to see a shift towards ambulatory care in general. You're also going to see some very innovative moves towards hospitals in home, where companies will actually be able to do, we've all heard of home health, but this is where companies actually set up hospitals in the patient's home. So hospital bed, ICU level care can be delivered actually at the bedside in someone's home. And so you're going to see those types of shifts in healthcare as well, that I think that, frankly, without the pandemic, it would have probably taken much longer, but because of the pandemic, we were forced to do much of that in a much more rapid pace. And I think you continue to see healthcare move in that rapid pace.
Well, Carla, that's really insightful. I have never even heard the concept of hospitals in home and setting up ICU units and so forth. So that's a brand new concept to me, at least. So thank you for sharing that with us. And yes, you are right. The loss of life cannot be overstated, and what this whole pandemic has meant to us. And we appreciate you and all the first responders and all the work that everybody did to get through this really, really challenging time. So want to restate that again, and thank you for all your service of yourself, your teams, and just all the first responders.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
So Paul Single, I want to go back to something you said, switching gears back to the economy a little bit. We were talking about the economy, of COVID, pre-COVID, post-COVID, and what we can expect to see moving forward. And inflation, you touched on that. That's a factor. And when we look at the high level of the federal debt, what kind of concern does that present to you in the banking industry?
Those are two good questions. First of all, the inflation part. Yeah, a lot of consumers are seeing much higher inflation. Where they're shopping, prices are a whole lot higher. Most notably, you're seeing this in used car prices. They're up almost 20%. But the reason why they're up so much is the fact that new car production is very, very low at this stage because of the lack of semiconductors that are needed to build the cars. So people are pushing up the prices of used cars. It's also for paper products, cleaning products, stuff that you've bought it for home. Where people are shopping, prices are up quite a bit because supply cannot meet the demand. But where people are not shopping, prices have been falling quite a bit. You see this in airfares, hotel rates, transportation costs, that sort of thing. Overall, inflation is still in the range of about 1.5% to 2%, even though some, again, these areas where we're seeing 10 and 20% increases where there are shortages. But overall, inflation is expected to be staying low. These are transitory, short-term problems. Two things are causing inflation to be high right now. One, the supply-demand aspect that I spoke about, but then, that's the benefit of a capitalistic society. If prices move up, people come in and meet that demand, and prices start to fall back down again. The other aspect is that people are comparing prices against last year. I mean, remember, we were shut down last year. If you look at oil prices year over year, they're up almost 200%, which, is a shockingly high number. But if you look at oil prices and compare it to where we were before this recession started, let's say December of 2019, they're only up $2 a barrel, so that's about 4%. That's not that big of a deal. So yeah, it's making a lot of news and creating headlines, but it's long-term, it's not a concern. We will have high inflation this year, but it will start moving back to the Fed's goal of around 2%, maybe a little bit higher than that. In terms of the federal debt, is that a problem? Yeah, I mean, we're borrowing an awful lot of money, way more than we're bringing in. We're borrowing about $2 for every dollar we bring in revenue, and that's excessively high. But that's also the trend that we've been seeing in Washington, D.C., pretty much since the 1980s. Up until then, the government would borrow money when we went into a recession, but then cut back on the amount of spending as soon as the expansion happened. But that's not been the general trend in Congress of the last few decades. It's the old joke. I mean, if you want to get elected to a political office, you say you're going to cut taxes and you're going to bring spending to your district. Well, that increases the deficit, and we've been seeing that movement go on. Right now, the federal government is borrowing about 100% of the size of the economy, and that's the level that economists start to get worried. We will see more spending going on this year, a big deficit, but the expectation is that it will start to curtail after that you won't see the big government spending that we've seen in the last few years. So hopefully it will start coming down after that. No one's saying that we shouldn't be spending money to try and get the economy at a faster pace. We're looking for that. We need that. We need to get people back on the payrolls. But as soon as the economy starts to get back to trend level, then the government spending should subside at that point.
Well, Paul, you make some interesting remarks about spending and prices this year compared to last year, and oil prices, were one of the things you mentioned. And I know at Switch, Betsy, Switch has been a leader in sustainability and clean energy practices. Do you think this global crisis and the global cooperation in addressing that will build even more collaboration in tackling those environmental challenges?
Well, I think we learned a lot over the last year, right? So when everything kind of went on a pause in direct relation to the COVID peaks over the last several months, we saw greenhouse gas emissions decrease. As we look forward, many companies are really evaluating their ESG placement, if you will, for investors, frankly, to encourage investors to continue to make investments in them going forward. Switch has been very aggressive on the sustainability front, investing in our own solar resources, basically becoming our own power generation solution. And as a result of that, we've seen some pretty significant improvements in that regard. What we're hoping is that as data centers and other technology service delivery systems and infrastructure providers continue to grow, because they're going to. I mean, year over year, we're looking at over a 7% growth in this industry alone, this segment of tech, for the foreseeable future. And that's pretty significant growth in cloud computing, data centers, hybrid cloud solutions, et cetera. So as that continues to grow, we have to figure out a more sustainable way to power those service delivery mechanisms. The other thing is that the chips are getting smaller, which is great, although there's a bit of a chip shortage right now. They're also consuming a lot more energy. So there's a lot of issues associated with this entire industry really having a dramatic impact on the energy profile and energy usage profile going forward for us as a country, but also globally. So right now, and this is just Betsy's opinion on this, it feels like the investment community is really starting to create the pressure to enhance performance on ESG. Whether that'll translate globally, honestly, I don't know. But it is translating here in the US. And I believe that'll help us see some greenhouse gas emission reductions over time And I know that that's a big push of the current administration, and has been a push of prior administrations. So, I think we're going to start to see that continue, that trend continue. But I think we also have to be mindful that this industry is growing and the demand for this industry is growing. Paul mentioned some of the supply line challenges, and I didn't say this in my introductory answer, but that was a challenge for everybody. But as a data center, who would have thought that, cleaning supplies would be a supply line challenge, right? I mean, we keep a pretty immaculate place, but we're not the only ones struggling with some of those supply line challenges. So in addition to some of those sustainability issues that you traditionally think about, energy utilization, there are also other sustainability factors as it relates to the supply line challenges. And Mary Beth, you know this very well. We've been talking about this at the chamber board level. We've been talking about it at the Las Vegas Global Economic Alliance and how we position ourselves to really create robust supply lines, particularly in Southern Nevada, to help our businesses here be more resilient to things like we experienced over the last year and a half. So I think that whole concept of sustainability goes beyond just green energy. It's really that entire holistic approach to making sure that we're all as sustainable as we can be. And that's a key factor in what Switch does going forward and what we've been really successful at doing in the past.
Yeah, it's definitely a key factor in what Switch is doing moving forward, what all of the industries are. You mentioned a 7% growth in tech for the foreseeable future, if I heard you correctly. Can you share with us any specifics about how it's changed Switch's approach to the future, especially with cities?
Well, there's a lot of things that seem to be happening in the industry. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions. There's pretty massive expansion on the part of the public clouds in expanding their data center footprints across this country and globally. So there's a lot happening in the data center space because this is the infrastructure that fuels the internet and every transaction that happens. All of the things that Carla mentioned that are happening, moving to technology-based solutions, being able to support in-home care, all of the online activities, retail and otherwise. I mean, even the things that Michael's talking about as far as growth and development go are, dependent upon this new technology infrastructure being robust and being able to deliver, incredibly high speeds of data transmission to people working from home, be able to handle high def video transmissions and a variety of other things. So the needle has really moved. As far as Switch is concerned, we obviously are continuing to keep an eye on the future. And one of the things that we've been investing pretty heavily in is automation. So we have our own robotics line. We've been working on that for quite some time now. We've got a robust partnership with Dell going forward, and looking at edge computing. And so all of these things really speak to this overall ecosystem that's being developed around technology. So for Switch, while data centers are our primary mission and our core business, a lot of these other technology deployments are critically important, not only for our own production, our own ability to keep our price point low and to keep our service delivery at a top-notch level by using automation, robotics, et cetera. We also know that we need to build out this robust technology infrastructure to support what's happening out in those other businesses to best help them as they grow and develop. So we're keeping an eye on all of those fronts going forward. And it's a really exciting future as a result of that.
Yeah, it is really exciting. And you bring up an interesting point, Betsy, because technology pretty well touches certainly all of the industries that we have represented in our panel today. But it also extends to all other industries as well. And so I think you hit the nail on the head with that, because you guys have to be on the forefront and in your industry as you support your customers. And certainly, Michael, in the real estate area, I know technology is affecting you as well. I see that in the residential area, not to mention the other areas that you have already talked about in the conversation, but are there some silver lining areas that you would note, Michael, as we've progressed over the past year, whether it has to do with technology or other factors?
Yeah, and I think, both speakers who just talked about, Paul, inflation, and as it relates to my space, demand for goods, and then Betsy spoke to supply line challenges, and that gets to the clear winner in our space, which is in industrial. And so, when you're talking about the state of the industrial sector prior to COVID, and then what's happened, we have just an increased demand for more supply in the warehouse and distribution area. And then even a subset of that is cold storage, and how now that's come into play, because the viewpoint of the needs for those frozen goods to be a greater amount of supply to be available into the system. And so the result is industrial has clearly been the big winner out of this. Getting back to residential and technology, if you think about whether it's a new home you're buying or going in and renting an apartment, and for most of us, I think we're at the age where we can look at things now and we can look at things 20 years ago. Think about all the technology that goes into a home and or a dwelling, whether it's something you own or something you rent. But the silver lining winner, again, is in the residential area. I think when you look at demand for new home ownership, that's increased, double-digit growth year over year in the entry-level homes. On the multifamily side, there's been a concern about supply, but overall that's fared well. Occupancies are holding, and even collections, that was a huge concern. And overall, collections are holding also. For Carla's space, that's another kind of winner out of this. And, by my product, it's medical office, but it's related to healthcare and life sciences. And you look at all the activity and the capital in the global system that's now being driven into that space, and then how that translates into demand for those types of properties. And ultimately, in that space, that might prove to help out the office problem. And how can office properties be reconfigured into more of a special purpose related to healthcare and life science users?
Well, Michael, fascinating point about the double-digit growth, especially here in Nevada, in terms of residential, I guess across the board, really. North and South, Reno, Las Vegas, and the rurals are experiencing just tremendous growth. And you talked about collections as well. What are your predictions for how sustainable is that growth, and how much longer are we going to witness that here in Nevada?
Well, I think, the sustainability one, the state of the consumer side of things, but in real estate, success brings with it problems. And I think one of the key problems, getting back to inflation, and Paul speaking to that, is the cost of materials. And so we think clearly the headwind right now is costs. You probably, if you're listening to some form of audio communications, however we do that nowadays, or if we even watch the television, you're hearing about lumber. That's a serious issue. You're talking about lumber prices, 300-400% increases. And so that's something that can really slow down the momentum, and Paul often will incorporate in his macro discussions the importance of home building activity. And so I think one of the things we're interested in seeing at City National, for all of us, as well as me specifically in real estate, is how are these material prices going to impact our industries. And it's not just lumber. There's other things, copper. So, there's a variety of costs that I think are really going to say a lot, despite how there's an improvement in employment and getting more people back to work, bringing more income and wealth into the system. Hopefully it doesn't get derailed from the cost side of things.
Well, it strikes me as we're talking about all these particular industries. We're talking about the economy. Carla brought up doing, having hospitals inside of homes. Betsy's talking about technology that could allow that new technology of the hospitals in these homes. And then Michael, you're talking about the prices of these homes and how that, so I'm struck by how all of these topics tie together even more maybe than we even realized when we started this whole conversation. Betsy, how do you see, if you were to work with if Switch was to work with hospitals or those organizations, how would you see a way to implement some of these hospitals and getting that smart technology into the homes as it relates to the medical field?
Well, that really does kind of trip over into the kind of the smart cities, smart communities kind of discussion, and the Internet of Things out and about. Obviously Switch's primary support is the data layer infrastructure to ensure that, we have the compute and the storage, and the networking capacity to be able to support systems like the one Carla described, and the ones that Michael described are being integrated into new construction. And so, our level of effort is to try and make sure that we're supporting those businesses who have made the decision to make those kinds of deployments happen in the most efficient, reliable, secure way. And so those are the kinds of things that we would bring our technology expertise to the table to help our business customers be able to make sure that they have the compute capacity to support those kinds of service delivery mechanisms or the appropriate kind of storage, maybe even some edge support if that's what they needed to have happen to be able to do that kind of intense deployment. I mean, the kind of compute that would be necessary to support that kind of network is pretty significant. We're lucky here in Vegas because we've got a place like Switch, but there are a lot of cities around the country that do not have that kind of infrastructure or that kind of bandwidth, so to speak. And as a result, those cities that are in a position to take advantage of that kind of technology deployment and infrastructure to support that kind of development are going to win the race. So, I think the Las Vegas metro region, the Reno Tahoe metro region are uniquely poised to take advantage of a lot of the technology that's been deployed here in our state. And then, there's just other parts of the country that just don't have it yet. And they're going to struggle to keep up. So that's the way I see it kind of playing together, Mary Beth. It'd be interesting to hear what Carla or Paul or Michael have to say about that. But I really do think it's all these different layers of infrastructure that are necessary to support those businesses' deployment from that business to that customer. And we're one of the key data layers in that process.
Mary Beth, if I could just tag on to what Betsy was saying, you mentioned data and data points, and I think it's another area that we're really starting to see in healthcare is the use of artificial intelligence, using those millions and billions of data points to make healthcare decisions. We're starting to see artificial intelligence around diagnostic tools, around patient navigation, where patients can enter information into a software and it will tell them whether they should be going to an urgent care or an emergency room. It can help doctors diagnose patients. And, and as I think about COVID and what we've been through, I think the biggest issue we had is we didn't know what we didn't know. And there was so much rapid change in the very beginning when COVID was first being diagnosed. And we frankly didn't know how to diagnose it initially. We thought it was a respiratory disease. We thought it was like flu. So we looked for, cold and flu type symptoms. And then we started to see patients with abdominal issues. And had we had the ability to use artificial intelligence from a worldwide perspective, I think we would have been able to diagnose patients in a much more rapid fashion. And frankly, we wouldn't have exposed as many people because we didn't put people into quarantine who probably should have been very early on because they didn't have the typical signs and symptoms, if you will. So I agree with everything that you said, and would just kind of layer on artificial intelligence to that as well, and kind of the future direction of how healthcare will go. I think you're frankly going to see some specialists, and we talk about healthcare shortages. You're going to see some specialists that are actually going to become obsolete in the future. For example, radiology, and my radiologist friends will probably not appreciate this, but you're going to be able to diagnose from an image through artificial intelligence without the human factor of bias and human error in diagnosing from those kinds of things. You'll probably see the same thing from a pathology perspective. And I think that we'll certainly use that type of technology and artificial intelligence in the future to help solve some of our healthcare shortages. And if I could just maybe comment a little bit, Mary Beth, on healthcare shortages, as we did see that quite significantly during COVID. Nevada was, one of the later to be hit with the surge, if you will. And of course, New York saw it more significant than we did very early on. And so you saw a lot of healthcare workers actually leave the state, doctors and nurses, to go to New York to help out in those situations, again, kind of running to the fire, but they were also being paid significant amount of money as an incentive to do that. And so many of them went, which unfortunately, when the surge did hit in Nevada, it left us shorthanded. I think the fact that kids weren't going to school either, and we had nurses who had childcare issues, who couldn't come to work because there was no one at home to be with their children and to help with their school, also impacted us from a healthcare perspective as well. So, and then we also just had, immunocompromised staff who, frankly, some had to stay home as a result. We had to get very creative, and we frankly invented new healthcare positions during the pandemic. We actually used laid off hospitality workers as what we called taskers. So because we didn't have enough nurses, we would do team nursing, where a nurse would practice at the top of their license, be able to take care of more patients than they normally would, but they'd have assistants with certified nursing assistants, but also taskers who were frankly not in healthcare before, but could run. They could run to the lab, they could run, get reports, they could do things, they could make phone calls. We also reached out and brought back a lot of retired nurses into and brought them back into the workforce to assist during COVID. And so I think you just get creative and we figure out ways, but I think as a result, we're looking differently on how we care for our patients. And Michael, you mentioned cost, and certainly labor is the biggest cost that we have. About 50% of our revenues do go to salaries, wages, and benefits for caring for our patients. So it is an area of certainly focus for us. I think as a result, Mary Beth, I know that the Chamber is extremely supportive of the medical school, and as are we, and certainly the advancement of graduate medical education throughout Las Vegas in all of the hospitals, I think will make a big difference. Physicians tend to practice where they learned. So many of them who will, if they can do their residency in Las Vegas, will come back and practice here. And so we're pleased to be able to expand in all of our hospitals graduate medical education programs, and hopefully keep our new graduates from UNLV as well as from Toro and hopefully Roseman in the future here in Las Vegas.
Mary Beth, real quickly, just to continue dovetailing, we talk about tech, and getting back to my first topic, office and return to office. In one of the key ingredients is going to be within all of us, is how do we get our employees to feel comfortable in returning to the office? And do they feel safe? And then, so I think whether you're a company and a user of office real estate or an owner, it gets back to the tech. So as far as the safety, all of a sudden at the top of the list is advancements that have been made in, you're talking about air quality and filtration, and how does technology play into that? And then aside from the human aspect, just the general use of technology. And the winners out of this are going to be the ones that can convince their colleagues that they're safe, and then offer a new environment, and tech's going to play into that. So, as we move now from, we were previously in closed offices to open creative space, but with designated workstations, now we're going to have flexible work areas. We're going to be using conference rooms and huddle rooms that, again, getting back to technology, it's going to require technology for a substantial greater amount of video conferencing. So as you said, it kind of ties in together.
Yeah, very much so. And I know, Paul, you were invited to make some comments on this topic as well. I wasn't sure, didn't want to leave you out if you have some comments to make, because I'm fascinated by this conversation. So I want to make sure you—
I am too. This is a great conference. But I think Betsy said it off right at the beginning where she quoted Michael Dell. Technology kept us through this whole pandemic and kept the economy moving along, whether it was shopping or whether it was the ability for especially professional services being able to stay employed and continue to earn an income, with calls like Zoom. We were talking about this earlier. 2 years ago, if you said to a prospect, I'd like to meet you over a video call, they would say, I'm not that big of a prospect, no thanks. Now it's completely acceptable. And so it is a driving force. And as Michael was saying, and also what Carla was saying, in terms of the focus of what people are concerned about going forward, it will stay with us for some time. It might not be this pandemic, but there's that fear that we will see another pandemic come upon us very, very quickly, because in a world that we live in where travel is so quick, this stuff can spread very, very quickly. So it will be in the back of the minds of many people in terms of how they spend their money and how they spend their time. So technology will help out an awful lot. I mean, for me to go into an office like I did today, I had to fill out an awful lot of forms to do that, and it needs to be all approved. But everything will be changing in terms of how the workplace is designed, and even the stuff, as Michael was saying, the stuff you don't think about. I've never spent an ounce of time at work thinking about the air quality at work, but now you give it a little bit of thought. So to me, it's part of the excitement of the economy that we will have ahead of us for the next few years.
I would definitely agree with you. And I want to come back to you, Paul, in a second. But before I do, I want to applaud Carla for inventing these positions and relying on the hospitality workers and retired folks to come back. I think that is absolutely raising the bar and outside the box thinking. I didn't know that you were doing that. You've given me all kinds of great information today, and hopefully our viewers as well. So I just want to applaud you for that, and thank you for being so creative.
Me too.
Thank you.
Yeah, you are totally welcome. Thank you so much. Paul, I wanted to ask you, I want to switch gears for a second in just the few minutes that we have left. I'm getting a lot of questions, and I get these regularly, and I'm getting them now. We recently did our preview event. It was actually last January already, but one of the topics that came up a lot, it still continues to come up, is Bitcoin and all the stock trades and GameStop and so forth. Give us your opinion on that, and what bodes, what's ahead in the future for that?
There's a lot going on there. Bitcoin is one of many digital currencies that are available, but it's the first, so it's the most popular. And, it's been around since, I don't know, 2014, 2015 or so. And, back then it was nefarious people that tended to use it, transfer some sort of value across borders without governments knowing about it. So that's who it was known for. But it's become mainstream. I mean, it's very easy for you to go online to a brokerage firm and be able to buy Bitcoin or other digital currencies. And you also see it in transactions. For a while there, you could buy a Tesla with Bitcoin, but you can't now. And the reason that they gave for that is the energy cost. And it's a very important point. I mean, when you buy something with Bitcoin, the amount of energy it requires for that transfer from one person to another is equal to that of about 700,000 Visa transactions. So you can see it's not something that's usable. And it's not really usable as a currency. It doesn't make much economic sense for a couple of reasons. One, every time you sell it, you realize a capital gain or a capital loss. So you have to declare that on your taxes. That becomes an annoying factor. Secondly, it doesn't hold its value. What you spend it on will, the value of the Bitcoin will change. I mean, there's the great urban lore story about, a few years ago, someone paid for a pizza with Bitcoin. Well, that Bitcoin now would be worth more than $1 million. I mean, do you really want to be using that? We don't invest in it for our clients because it's not really a traditional asset. Most assets have an intrinsic value. If you own a bond, you're getting a cash flow payment every 6 months in principal. You're getting something for that. If you're getting a stock, you have a dividend and the potential for high earnings, which might propel the price up. Or even a commodity like lumber, it's used for a house, it has some value. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, neither do any of the other digital currencies, because the price is only as good as whatever the next person's willing to pay. And you're seeing that. I mean, we've got lots of questions over the last few months, starting in January, as it escalated up in price quite a bit. But now that it's come down about 50% in price in the matter of about a week or so, we're not hearing about it too often. And that's the thing. Bitcoin, like GameStop, as you mentioned, there's a lot of cash out there on the sidelines. It's very easy to buy these things at a very low cost or no commission. So there's a lot of speculators out there that are driving up the cost of these things that we don't see any value in at all. So to us, it's another one of the bubbles that we've seen ever since the 1970s with gold, with investing in Japan and Thailand and so forth. This is another one of those bubbles. This one's a little bit different because, again, there's no intrinsic value to the asset.
It is. Everybody sure is. Like you said, I was watching financial news yesterday and they could not stop talking about it. So thank you for your perspective on that. Really appreciate it. I know that with this panel especially, I think we could continue this conversation all day, but in just the few minutes we do have left, I want to go back to Betsy for a second. You were city manager for a lot of years. How do you see this pandemic sort of permanently impacting community life? And how do you think we'll live and interact moving forward?
Well, I mean, obviously it's changed the way we do things, and our reliance on some of those traditional systems is less so. So at a very kind of day-to-day level of things, you're looking at reevaluating things like your transit and transportation systems potentially as dependence and development of autonomous systems continue to proliferate, whether it's delivery services or a variety of your own personal transportation needs. That has a big impact on how much infrastructure we need and what kind. That can change the look and feel of communities as a result of that. There's wholesale changes that are likely to be happening based on a lot of the continued remote work. I mean, Michael might say, "Oh, Betsy, please, we need people to go back to the office." Real estate depends upon it. But the point is that I think there's a real sweet spot that's starting to emerge where people are actually going to be taking and using their homes more productively throughout the day because they're able to work from here. Well, that impacts business licensing. So there's a whole host of things that are going to have to adapt at the local government level to create that infrastructure to support that new way of living and the new expectations of the individuals who choose to live there. The other thing I think that's going to happen, Mary Beth, is that you're going to see a lot of people who they can do remote work from anywhere. So pitching your community as a place where you can come and live and work remotely is going to be very attractive for the new employee. So I think those things are going to be kind of a unique niche, particularly for those highly connected communities, like I was mentioning in my comments earlier, because you can support that kind of work. So I think there's going to be some pretty significant changes, but honestly, governments move slowly. Changing a regulatory infrastructure like that takes a lot of time, because governments want to know that what they do is not going to cause some kind of major sea change. So I think it'll take time, but I also do think it'll migrate away from some of the regulations we have in place now to support this new way of delivering services, businesses, and living. And really, the local governments don't have any choice but to make those kinds of modifications to accommodate this new way of living and working.
I agree with you, Betsy, and I would even take that a step further to say that this new and work from home situation really bodes well for Nevada being a sort of destination state. And folks, hopefully will want to move here and live here and work here, and including, other industries that we could get to come to our state as well. So I think what you said really lends itself to that entire discussion as well. But I think we could probably spend a whole nother hour at least on that alone. All right, we're just about to the top of the hour here, but I want to make sure everybody's had a chance to say some closing remarks. Does anyone have anything else to add? This has been just a wonderful conversation. I can't tell you how much we appreciate City National Bank for your partnership and for all of you joining us today. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was just going to say, despite some of the things we've all talked about and challenges, I think we can all agree that the worst is behind us. And so, I think that's what's most important. In my space, we're expecting pressure to continue, and might there be some downward trending over the next year or so? Yes, but certainly where we are now, and if we were to have done this about a year ago, I think the conversation and content and forecast would be much different for all of us, and including the opinions of our guests that are online.
And Mary Beth, I would just add that from my perspective, the one thing that really kind of struck me throughout the entire pandemic was how collaborative we became as a community. And not only from a hospital and a healthcare perspective, and people who I viewed as competitors previously, we all came together because we all had a common purpose and a common cause. And even non-healthcare related, we received so much PPE from hotels and food and the outpouring of support. As a community, it was just incredibly heartwarming to see how everybody came together to collaborate. And I think that just speaks so well for Southern Nevada in general.
I would absolutely agree with you. And that was the same in the business sector as well. All the trade associations across the entire state came together in ways that we've never seen before, including the economic development organizations, North and South and rural. So I would definitely agree with you there, Carla. Paul?
Yes, this is one of the exciting things about the United States, about America, about Americans, in terms of free markets. If you look at how well this economy is doing relative to all the economies around the world, it's gangbusters compared to the rest of the world. We're doing so much better, mainly because we've managed this thing very, very well, and the entrepreneurship of everybody along the way in terms of managing it. To me, it's one of the great, great chapters of American history.
Future's bright.
The future's bright. Thank you, Betsy. With that, it's 10 o'clock. On behalf of all of us at the Vegas Chamber, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Paul Single, Michael Kazimzada, Carla Perez, and Betsy Fretwell. Thank you so much for your time. And we appreciate City National Bank once again for presenting this opportunity. Thank you all so much and have an awesome day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.